Hey guys, like I said earlier, I don't know if I'm going to film all the electrical stuff, so I've done quite a bit without filming it because who really wants to watch 10 hours of wiring? So I'm going to show you guys what I've done and what the next step is. We're just about ready to start wiring up the fuse block. So most of the wiring of the engine loom has been done in preparation for that. So after I ohmed out all of these pink wires, I labeled them just with the label maker. Some of them were already in bundles, like injector number 5 and 7, 2 and 4, 1 and 3, and so on. This one that says shift, that just goes down to the transmission shift solenoids. There's O2 sensor wires in there, mass airflow. So I just labeled each pair, and then as we come down here, I reduced the number of wires from 4 to 5 down to 1 in each one of these bundles. And how I chose to do it, people on the internet do it different ways. Some people will group all of the injectors together and then group the ignition coils together. And you can reduce the number of fuses depending on how you do this, but I wired this more like how the factory setup is. So what I have is all the injectors for bank 1 and the ignition coils for bank 1 tied into this one loom. They will be on the same fuse together. Then we have bank 2 injectors and bank 2 coils. And then in this bundle is all the other stuff, the mass airflow, shift solenoids, whatnot. The reason I do this is, for some reason, if one of the coils shorts out, pops a fuse, the engine should still run on one bank. It won't run very good, but it might be enough to get you off the road somewhere safe if these were both tied together with either the ignition coils or the injectors. When that fuse pops, the engine shuts off, it's done. So I chose to break them up by bank. Then also here, this is the lead going to the starter. I brought it down this harness. It's going to go through a relay. You don't have to. I could have tied it into this pink wire up here. This wire comes from the ignition switch, but I'm going to run it through the relay just because I don't want to put too much load on that old ignition switch and have it fail. And I've kind of tidied up the harness, taped it up a little bit. I'm not going to loom it until we're all done, just in case there's anything I missed. I still haven't sealed the plug or the empty holes in the back of the PCM connector yet. But I did add 2 wires in here for cooling fan control. Actually, it might have just been the one wire because I think one of them was already there. It was just programmed to be something different. So those all come up here. So I have my pink wires that I reduced all those other ones down, and then I have the bundle of stuff coming from the PCM, and this is all stuff that is either going to go to the fuse block or that needs to go into the passenger area of the vehicle. Originally I wanted to add some pins to the factory plugins. There's one here, but all of those pins are occupied. There's one behind the engine, and let's see if we can get that there. That one there, I think, has 3 open slots. But I quickly realized that I'm going to have a lot more than 3 things going in there because I have speedometer output, tachometer output. None of that stuff will get used right now, but if we ever upgrade this to a digital dash in the future, we're going to need some of that stuff. This is the serial data line. That's what's going to go to the data link connector under the hood, or under the dash, so we can scan this down the road if we get a check engine light. The mill, that's check engine light there, malfunction indicator lamp. And this one that says TCC brake, that goes to the brake light switch, and it will disengage the torque converter clutch if you're going on the highway and hit the brake. That way the engine doesn't stall. These 2 orange wires are the constant battery feeds going to the PCM. One is on pin 20, the other's on 57. I can't remember if this was on the blue or red connector. I have those going into one lead. I'll show you guys how these heat shrink and solder butt connectors work. A lot of people use the ones that just have heat shrink and solder or heat shrink and the butt connector. I use the one that has both. We call them a multi-link connector. That's what the manufacturer calls them that I get them from. You can solder these together and heat shrink them yourself. This speeds up the process a little bit. All the stuff I did on the individual wire splices in the engine harness here, I soldered and heat shrinked. Some of the stuff where I have the bigger wires coming together, I do it this way. Speaking of which, right here, these connections are a non-insulated crimp sleeve, which I have right here. So what I do is I slide the that heat shrink over the loom. I strip all these back. I crimped it, and then I soldered them by feeding solder into that little hole in the connector on the side and into both ends. And then I ran that heat shrink over it and shrunk it down. So that should be a good connection. The heat shrink I used has the sealant in it, so it sealed that bundle of wires together. Pink wires here, these are the ignition feeds to the PCM. There's 2 of them. I ran those into one wire as well. Now, some of this wire I just scavenged from this pile of wires that I removed from the harness. So there's a lot of wires in there that are pink because that's ignition feed to almost everything. So I just grabbed a length of wire out of there because the only pink wire I have is this heavier wire. I don't know if this is a 14 or 12. It's a 14 gauge. The orange wire I had in stock. This wire here goes to the ground wires in the harness. I think there's 2 of them. I'm going to run that out to ground my relays. And then the other wires that I brought out of here are the 2-fan control that I mentioned, and I have, I think, fuel pump control. So that relay box, I'm going to mount it right here. The PCM will be mounted down in the bottom. So I got to run all these into that relay panel, and I made a diagram last night on the relay box, trying to make it a little easier today when I go to install all this stuff, so I don't screw up and have to buy more crimp-on terminals. So this big red wire goes inside, feeds the ignition switch, cigarette lighter, and a few other things. So we need to run that to B positive. Instead of running that down to here and then running another lead to the battery, I did the same thing with that barrel connector or butt connector, crimped it, soldered it, heat shrinked it. I have a short lead that I'll run down to the horn relay there. And then I have a longer lead that will go over to the battery. This bigger wire is the one that I'm going to run into the fuse box. And this will go to the main relay or the EFI relay in the fuse box, and it'll also feed a bunch of other stuff. So I have it, you know, like a foot or 2 extra wire length. I'll get everything mounted up here, and then I'll loom this over to the battery, and then I'll tidy up my wires over there. So that's most of the wiring modifications that I've done since the last video. Just mainly modifying the power feed and getting stuff ready to hook up to the fuse panel, go into the cabin, and get the controls ready. Also a bunch of labeling. I didn't label anything initially, but once I start hooking up wires here in the fuse panel, there's a lot of connections, so I want to get the stuff hooked up right. I'll show you guys how those heat shrink or those multi-link butt connectors work real quick, and in the next video I'll be wiring up that relay panel. So what I do on these is I melt the heat shrink first. And I start from the inside and work my way out. And I run the torch in flame mode just because if you run it on the torch mode, it's really easy to blister the heat shrink. And I just keep moving back and forth because I want to build heat on the whole thing. So now that the ends are getting shrunk down, I can start bringing the heat back towards the middle. And once I get enough heat in the middle, there's that little band in the center there, that's the solder. That solder will melt and flow into the connector. So it just started to flow there. I'm going to keep a little heat on it. Now the heat shrink also just pushes on that solder, pushes it in there. We got a little warm. But as you can see, there's no longer a big lump right there. The band is gone. The solder has flowed into the connector and joined the two wires. So I like this method because you have a crimp connection and a solder connection. So you have two forms of connection. It's very tight, you can't rip it apart, and then the heat shrink seals it and gives you additional strain relief on both sides of the connector. I also have these really small ones. I need to see if I have any more because this was the last one in my kit. Otherwise I'm going to have to call my supplier and get some more, because even though there's several suppliers that I can get these from, I only have one supplier that can get me this 20 to 22 gauge connector. Thanks for watching. Next video is the relay panel, so subscribe, click the bell, and catch that one when it comes out.